They stood him in the freezing snow for hours. His feet went numb first. Then came the burning sensation that felt like thousands of needles piercing his skin. His body shook uncontrollably. The Japanese interrogators circled him like wolves stalking wounded prey, shouting the same question over and over in broken English and Japanese. Decode the messages. Tell us what they mean. Explain how it works. But Joe Lee Kiyomiya couldn't give them what they desperately wanted. Not because he refused to cooperate. Because what they played for him on those crackling recordings sounded like absolute nonsense. Like someone had randomly strung together Navajo words without any meaning or purpose. Even though he spoke the language fluently since childhood, even though Navajo was the first language he learned from his mother, he couldn't break the code. He couldn't even understand it. And that confusion, that genuine inability to help his captors, would nearly cost him his life dozens of times over the next 3 years. Joe Lee Kiyomiya was born in 1919 on the vast Navajo reservation that stretched across portions of New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah. The reservation was a land of dramatic contrasts, with towering red rock formations, deep canyons, high desert plateaus, and scattered communities where Navajo families maintained their traditional way of life, despite the pressures of the modern world, encroaching from all sides. Joe grew up in a world where 2 languages shaped his identity and his understanding of reality. He spoke Navajo with his family, learning the complex grammar and unique sounds of a language completely unrelated to English or any European tongue. Navajo was a tonal language, where the pitch and inflection of a word could completely change its meaning. It contained sounds that didn't exist in English. It structured sentences and concepts in fundamentally different ways from Indo-European languages. Joe also learned English, the language of the government schools, the traders, and the wider American society that surrounded the reservation. Like many Native American children of his generation, he navigated between 2 worlds, 2 cultures, 2 ways of understanding life. The Navajo world emphasized harmony with nature, respect for elders, connection to the land, and complex spiritual beliefs that had sustained his people for centuries. The American world emphasized individual achievement, economic success, and assimilation into mainstream culture. Joe learned to move between these worlds, speaking Navajo at home and English when necessary for dealing with the outside world. The 1930s were difficult years on the reservation and across America. The Great Depression devastated the national economy, but Native American communities, already among the poorest in the country, suffered even more severely. Jobs were scarce. Money was scarce. Opportunities were limited. Many young Navajo men looked for ways to escape the poverty of reservation life. Some found work in cities. Others joined the Civilian Conservation Corps, a New Deal program that provided employment on conservation projects. And some, like Joe Lee Kiyomiya, enlisted in the United States military. For Native Americans, military service represented a complicated choice. The United States government had spent decades trying to destroy Native cultures, forcing children into boarding schools, where they were punished for speaking their languages, seizing tribal lands, and implementing policies designed to eliminate Native identity. Yet many Native Americans still felt a strong sense of patriotism and a warrior tradition that predated European contact by centuries. When young Native men joined the military, they were following in the footsteps of ancestors who had been warriors and defenders of their people. Joe enlisted before World War II began, joining the Army at a time when conflict seemed distant, but increasingly inevitable. By 1941, Joe found himself assigned to the 200th Coast Artillery Regiment, an anti-aircraft unit from New Mexico that included many Hispanic and Native American soldiers. The unit had been mobilized for federal service and deployed to the Philippine Islands, an American territory in the Western Pacific. The Philippines seemed like an exotic posting, far from home but not particularly dangerous. American military planners considered the islands an important defensive position, but few expected them to become a major battleground. Joe and his fellow soldiers settled into the routine of military life in a tropical climate, training on their anti-aircraft guns, dealing with the heat and humidity, and enjoying the relative peace of garrison duty in a foreign land. Everything changed on December 7, 1941. Japanese carrier-based aircraft struck the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, sinking battleships, destroying aircraft, and killing thousands of American servicemen in a surprise attack that shocked the nation. But Pearl Harbor wasn't the only target. Japan had planned a coordinated offensive across the entire Pacific and Southeast Asia. Within hours of the Pearl Harbor attack, Japanese bombers appeared over the Philippines. They struck American air bases, destroying much of the American air power on the ground before pilots could even get their planes airborne. Clark Field and other installations were devastated. The Japanese had achieved tactical surprise and air superiority in the opening hours of the war. Joe and the 200th Coast Artillery went from peacetime garrison duty to desperate combat almost overnight. Their anti-aircraft guns engaged Japanese bombers as wave after wave attacked American and Filipino positions. The artillerymen shot down some enemy aircraft, but the Japanese kept coming. Within days, Japanese ground forces began landing on the Philippine Islands. The invasion had begun in earnest. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding American and Filipino forces in the Philippines, quickly realized his troops couldn't defend the entire archipelago against the massive Japanese assault. He ordered a retreat to the Bataan Peninsula, a mountainous finger of land on the western side of Manila Bay. The plan was to hold Bataan and the fortress island of Corregidor at the mouth of the bay, denying the Japanese use of Manila's harbor and buying time for reinforcements to arrive from the United States. The retreat to Bataan was chaotic. Thousands of American and Filipino soldiers, along with civilian refugees, crowded onto the peninsula. Supply lines were disrupted. Food, ammunition, medicine, and other essential supplies quickly ran short. MacArthur had planned for a possible siege, but his supply stockpiles were nowhere near adequate for the number of troops and civilians who ended up trapped on Bataan. Joe and the 200th Coast Artillery took up defensive positions, their anti-aircraft guns now used against Japanese ground forces as well as aircraft. The Battle of Bataan began on January 7, 1942, exactly 1 month after Pearl Harbor. For 3 months, American and Filipino forces held out against determined Japanese attacks. The defenders fought with incredible courage despite impossible conditions. Food rations were cut repeatedly as supplies dwindled. Soldiers received half rations, then quarter rations. They hunted for anything edible in the jungle, catching monkeys, snakes, lizards, anything that might provide protein. Malaria swept through the ranks. Without adequate quinine supplies, thousands of men fell ill with the disease. Dysentery, dengue fever, and other tropical diseases added to the misery. Men became skeletons, too weak to carry their weapons, but still manning defensive positions because there was no alternative. Japanese forces pressed their attacks relentlessly. Artillery bombardments pounded American positions. Infantry assaults probed for weaknesses. The defenders held, but barely. Ammunition ran low. Medical supplies ran out. Wounded men died from infections that would have been easily treatable with proper medicine. The promised reinforcements never arrived. The United States was fighting a two-ocean war, and Europe took priority over the Pacific. The men on Bataan were on their own. General MacArthur was ordered to evacuate to Australia in March, leaving his troops behind with a promise to return. For the soldiers remaining on Bataan, that promise seemed hollow. By early April 1942, the situation became untenable. Disease and starvation had reduced the defenders to shadows of their former selves. Japanese forces prepared a final massive assault. On April 9, 1942, American forces on Bataan surrendered. Approximately 75,000 Filipino and American soldiers became prisoners of war. It was the largest surrender in American military history. Joe Lee Kiyomiya, weakened by malnutrition and disease like everyone else, became a prisoner of the Imperial Japanese Army. The Japanese had expected to capture perhaps 25,000 prisoners. Instead, they found themselves responsible for 3 times that number. They had made almost no preparations for handling such a massive number of prisoners. Worse, Japanese military culture viewed surrender as the ultimate disgrace. Soldiers were expected to fight to the death rather than surrender. The Japanese had contempt for soldiers who surrendered, viewing them as having forfeited any right to honorable treatment. This attitude, combined with inadequate planning and supplies, created the conditions for one of World War II's worst atrocities. The Japanese decided to march the prisoners from Bataan to prison camps further north, a distance of over 60 miles. What became known as the Bataan Death March began immediately after the surrender. Tens of thousands of already weakened, sick, and starving men were forced to walk under the scorching tropical sun with almost no food or water. Japanese guards, many of whom had just endured months of hard combat themselves, showed no mercy. They beat prisoners who walked too slowly. They bayoneted or shot men who fell and couldn't get up. They denied water to men dying of thirst. Prisoners who broke ranks to drink from streams were killed. Men who stopped to help fallen comrades were beaten or killed alongside them. The march was a nightmare beyond description. Bodies lined the route. The tropical heat was overwhelming. Dust choked marching men. Some prisoners died from dehydration. Others collapsed from exhaustion. Disease and starvation had already weakened everyone before the march even began. Now they were being driven like animals, covering mile after mile with no rest, no food, and minimal water. Japanese guards on horseback or in trucks observed the suffering with indifference. Some guards committed casual acts of brutality, killing prisoners for sport or entertainment. The march continued for days, with prisoners dying by the hundreds and then by the thousands. Joe survived. Somehow, despite everything, he kept putting one foot in front of the other. He watched men fall beside him. He saw guards bayonet prisoners too weak to continue. He witnessed atrocities that would haunt him forever. But he survived. Perhaps he was slightly stronger than some. Perhaps luck played a role. Perhaps sheer determination kept him moving when his body wanted to give up. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 5,000 and 11,000 men died during the Bataan Death March. Those who survived reached prison camps in a state of near death themselves. When Joe arrived at the prison camp, he faced a new ordeal. Japanese guards processed the prisoners, searching them and conducting initial interrogations. When the guards saw Joe's face, confusion registered immediately. His features didn't match what they expected an American soldier to look like. Some guards became suspicious and then angry. They began shouting at him in Japanese, demanding explanations. Some guards believed he might be Japanese American, a person of Japanese descent who had been born in America and was now fighting against Japan. In Japanese eyes, this would make him a traitor to his ancestral people, someone deserving of special punishment. The guards beat Joe savagely. They hit him with rifle butts and fists. They kicked him when he fell. They screamed questions he barely understood. Joe tried to explain that he was Navajo, a Native American, but the language barrier and the guards' rage made communication nearly impossible. The beating continued until officers intervened, and more careful interrogation established Joe's identity. He was indeed Navajo, a member of one of the Native American tribes indigenous to the southwestern United States. The beating stopped, but Joe was left battered and bruised, having suffered yet another layer of abuse on top of everything he had already endured. The confirmation of Joe's Navajo identity should have ended the matter, but it didn't. Instead, it triggered interest from an entirely different quarter. Japanese military intelligence officers learned that a Navajo prisoner was in the camp. This information was immediately flagged as potentially valuable. By 1942, the Japanese had become aware of a communication system the Americans were using that was proving impossible to break. Japanese code breakers had achieved remarkable success against various American codes and ciphers. They could read American diplomatic traffic. They had broken some military codes. This intelligence had given Japan significant advantages in several operations, but one particular code remained absolutely impenetrable. Japanese listening posts had intercepted radio transmissions that clearly contained military communications. The traffic patterns, the frequencies used, and the operational contexts made it obvious these were important messages. But the language was unlike anything Japanese linguists had encountered. It wasn't English. It wasn't any European language. It wasn't Chinese, Korean, or any Asian language they could identify. The phonetics were strange and difficult to reproduce. Every attempt to translate or analyze these messages failed completely. Japanese intelligence was utterly baffled. Then someone made the connection. The unbreakable code used a language that sounded similar to what some Native American prisoners were speaking among themselves. Further investigation suggested the mysterious language might be Navajo. For Japanese intelligence, this was a potentially massive breakthrough. If they could find someone who spoke Navajo and could explain how the code worked, they might finally crack the communication system that had frustrated them for months. The discovery that they had a Navajo prisoner seemed like an incredible stroke of luck. Joe Lee Kiyomiya was transferred from the general prisoner population and brought to the attention of intelligence officers. What the Japanese didn't understand, what they couldn't possibly understand without inside knowledge of American operations, was the sophisticated nature of the system they were trying to break. The Navajo Code was not simply people speaking Navajo over the radio. It was an elaborate, carefully designed encryption system that happened to use Navajo as its base language. The system had been developed by the United States Marine Corps, working with a group of Navajo men who volunteered for special duty and became known as the Code Talkers. The original concept emerged from the recognition that Native American languages, particularly those from smaller tribes, offered natural encryption advantages. During World War I, the U.S. military had experimented with using Choctaw speakers to transmit messages that German forces couldn't understand. The experiment was successful but limited in scope. When World War II began, a civil engineer named Philip Johnston, who had grown up on the Navajo reservation as the son of missionaries and spoke Navajo fluently, proposed using the Navajo language for military communications. He approached the Marine Corps with the idea. The Marines were interested, but cautious. They needed a communication system that was not only secure but also fast. Military operations depended on rapid, accurate communication. A code that took too long to encode and decode would be worthless in combat conditions. Johnston convinced the Marines to give the concept a test. In early 1942, the Marines recruited 29 Navajo men for a pilot program. These original 29 became the foundation of the Code Talker program. But the Code Talkers didn't just speak Navajo over the radio. They created an entirely new system built on top of the Navajo language. First, they developed Navajo equivalents for military terms that didn't exist in traditional Navajo vocabulary. They used metaphors and natural imagery. A tank became a turtle because a tank's armored shell resembled a turtle's protective covering. Different types of aircraft were given names of birds. A fighter plane was a hummingbird, fast and maneuverable. A bomber was a buzzard, slow but deadly. A submarine became an ironfish. Each branch of the military, each type of weapon, each tactical term received a Navajo code word. Then they created a phonetic alphabet system for spelling out words that didn't have code equivalents. Each letter of the English alphabet was assigned multiple Navajo words. The letter A could be represented by the Navajo word for ant, apple, or axe. The letter B could be bear, barrel, or bee. This redundancy made the system even more difficult to break, because the same letter might be encoded differently each time it appeared. A code talker transmitting a message could vary which Navajo word he used for each letter, making pattern analysis nearly impossible. The result was a communication system with multiple layers of encryption. An English message would first be encoded using the code talker system, transforming it into a sequence of Navajo words that represented military terms or spelled out words. Then this encoded message would be transmitted in Navajo over the radio. Someone intercepting the transmission would hear Navajo being spoken, but even someone who spoke Navajo fluently wouldn't understand the message without knowing the code system. The Navajo words were being used metaphorically and phonetically in ways that only trained code talkers understood. Joe Lee Kiyomiya had never received code talker training. He was not a Marine, he was Army. He had never been part of the special program. He knew nothing about the metaphorical substitutions or the phonetic alphabet. He spoke Navajo fluently because it was his native language, but he had no knowledge whatsoever of the elaborate encryption system the code talkers had created. When Japanese intelligence officers brought Joe into an interrogation room and played recordings of intercepted American transmissions, he heard something completely incomprehensible. The recordings crackled with static, and the voices were sometimes faint. But Joe could clearly hear that someone was speaking words that sounded like Navajo, but the words made absolutely no sense. It was like listening to someone say random words from a dictionary, without any grammatical structure or semantic meaning. The Navajo word for hummingbird, followed by the word for owl, followed by the word for turtle, followed by words that might be part of the phonetic spelling system, but created gibberish when taken literally. Joe's face showed genuine confusion as he listened. He didn't understand what he was hearing. The intelligence officers watched Joe's reaction carefully. They had recording equipment set up. They had translators present. They expected to see recognition dawn on Joe's face, perhaps followed by an attempt to hide his understanding. Instead, they saw authentic bewilderment. After the recording finished, they asked Joe what the message said. Joe told them the truth. He said the transmission made no sense to him. The words were Navajo, but the way they were used didn't create any coherent meaning. It sounded like nonsense. The interrogators didn't believe him. They thought Joe was being deliberately uncooperative. They thought he understood perfectly well, but was refusing to help them out of loyalty to the American military. The concept that someone who spoke Navajo wouldn't be able to understand a message transmitted in Navajo was beyond their comprehension. They didn't grasp that they were dealing with an encoded system layered on top of the base language. They thought language knowledge alone should be sufficient to understand the transmissions. The interrogation continued. The officers played more recordings. They asked the same questions repeatedly. What do the messages say? How does the code work? What are the Americans communicating? Joe gave the same answers every time because they were the only truthful answers he could give. He didn't understand the messages. They sounded like random Navajo words without meaning. He couldn't explain how the code worked because he didn't know how it worked. He had never even heard of the Code Talker program. The officers grew increasingly frustrated with what they perceived as Joe's stubborn refusal to cooperate. The frustration turned to anger and then to violence. If Joe wouldn't voluntarily provide the information they needed, the interrogators decided they would force it out of him. The torture began gradually. Guards would deny Joe food for days at a time, reasoning that hunger might make him more cooperative. They would force him to stand at attention for hours until he collapsed from exhaustion. They would hit him with bamboo rods, leaving painful welts across his back and legs. When these methods didn't produce results, the torture escalated. During winter months, when temperatures dropped and snow fell even in parts of Japan, guards would force Joe to stand outside barefoot in the snow. He would be left there for hours, sometimes an entire night, his body shaking uncontrollably from the cold. His feet would go numb first as the cold killed sensation. Then the pain would come, a burning agony as blood vessels constricted and tissue began to freeze. Frostbite would damage his feet, causing permanent injury. But still the interrogators demanded answers. Still they played recordings and asked him to decode messages. And still Joe could only tell them the truth. He didn't understand what he was hearing. The irony of the situation was almost unbearable. The Japanese had exactly what they needed to potentially make progress on understanding the code structure. They had a native Navajo speaker. They had actual recordings of Code Talker transmissions. They had time and motivation and resources. But they lacked the one critical element that made everything else meaningful: knowledge of the encryption system. Without understanding that the Navajo words were being used metaphorically and phonetically rather than literally, having all the other pieces meant nothing. It was like having a key that looked almost right for a lock but was actually slightly different. You could see that it was a key. You could see that it fit in the lock, but it wouldn't turn and open the door because the internal mechanisms didn't match. Joe spoke the same base language as the Code Talkers, but without the specific training in their system, he couldn't decode their messages any more than the Japanese could. The layers of encryption that made the code so secure also ensured that even a Navajo speaker without proper training was helpless to crack it. The interrogations went on for months. Joe would be brought in, recordings would be played, questions would be asked, answers would be rejected, and punishment would follow. The cycle repeated endlessly. The Japanese never wavered in their belief that Joe could break the code if he chose to cooperate. They couldn't accept that his confusion was genuine. They convinced themselves that he was an exceptionally stubborn prisoner, someone who would rather suffer than betray American military secrets. In a way, their assessment was correct, but not for the reasons they thought. Joe was protecting American secrets, but only because he genuinely didn't possess the knowledge to reveal them. Life as a prisoner of war meant dealing with far more than interrogations and torture. It meant surviving in brutal camps where conditions were deliberately harsh and death was a daily occurrence. The Japanese viewed prisoners with contempt and treated them accordingly. Prison camps operated under what the Japanese called the honor of death, the belief that prisoners had lost all honor by surrendering and therefore didn't deserve decent treatment. Camp conditions reflected this attitude. Food was grossly inadequate. Prisoners received tiny portions of rice, sometimes contaminated with insects, rats, or worse. A typical daily ration might consist of a small bowl of rice and perhaps some thin soup. This wasn't enough to sustain a grown man doing hard labor. Yet prisoners were forced to work in factories, mines, shipyards, and other facilities supporting the Japanese war effort. Men lost dramatic amounts of weight, becoming living skeletons with skin stretched over bones. Beriberi, a disease caused by vitamin B deficiency, was rampant. Men's legs swelled grotesquely, their hearts weakened. Many died from the combination of starvation and disease. Medical care was virtually non-existent. Camp hospitals were just buildings where sick prisoners were left to either recover or die with minimal intervention. Medicine was scarce and usually reserved for Japanese personnel. Prisoners with infected wounds had to hope their bodies could fight off infection without antibiotics. Many lost that battle. Tropical diseases like malaria, dysentery, and dengue fever swept through camps in epidemic waves. Pneumonia killed many during colder months. The death toll climbed steadily. Violence was casual and constant. Guards beat prisoners for minor infractions like not bowing deeply enough or not moving fast enough. They beat prisoners for no reason at all, simply because they could. Prisoners who tried to steal food because they were starving were beaten savagely or executed. Those who attempted escape faced torture and death, often in front of other prisoners as a warning. The guards operated with complete impunity. There was no oversight, no accountability, no consequences for their actions. Joe endured all of this while carrying the additional burden of being viewed as someone who possessed valuable information but refused to provide it. Even after the intensive interrogations ended, he remained a person of interest to camp authorities. He was watched more carefully than other prisoners. He was subjected to additional scrutiny and suspicion. The Japanese never stopped believing that he could decode the Navajo transmissions if sufficient pressure was applied. This made his captivity even more precarious than that of other prisoners. Years passed in grinding misery. 1942 became 1943, then 1944, then 1945. Joe and his fellow prisoners had no idea how the war was progressing. They didn't know that American forces were island hopping across the Pacific, pushing Japanese forces back toward the home islands. They didn't know about major battles at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. They heard rumors occasionally, whispered information from guards or from prisoners who were forced to work outside the camps and caught glimpses of newspapers or overheard conversations. But solid information was rare and unreliable. What prisoners could observe was that conditions were deteriorating. Food became even more scarce as the American naval blockade strangled Japanese supply lines. Air raid sirens sounded more frequently as American bombers struck Japanese cities and industrial facilities. Guards seemed more tense and angry. Something was clearly going wrong for Japan, but prisoners had no way to know how badly the war was going or how close liberation might be. They could only survive each day and hope that somehow, eventually, the war would end. As American forces advanced closer to Japan itself, the Japanese military began relocating prisoners from captured territories to Japan and other locations where they could be used as forced labor. These transfers occurred on transport ships that prisoners called hell ships, a name that accurately described the horrific conditions aboard these vessels. The Japanese packed prisoners into cargo holds designed to carry supplies, not human beings. Hundreds or even thousands of men would be crammed into spaces with no ventilation, no sanitation facilities, minimal food and water, and no medical care. Joe survived at least one hell ship voyage, probably when he was transferred from the Philippines to Japan. The journey was a nightmare of suffocation, dehydration, disease, and death. The holds were pitch black except when hatches were briefly opened. The heat was overwhelming, turning the spaces into ovens where men gasped for air. The stench of human waste, vomit, and death was overpowering. Men died from heat stroke, dehydration, disease, and simple despair. Their bodies remained in the holds with the living until the Japanese removed them. Some hell ships were accidentally attacked by American submarines or aircraft that didn't know they carried Allied prisoners. Thousands died in these attacks. By 1945, Joe found himself imprisoned in or near Nagasaki, a city on the Japanese island of Kyushu. Nagasaki was an important industrial center with shipyards, munitions factories, and other facilities supporting the Japanese war effort. It was also one of Japan's major ports. The city had a population of around 250,000 people. Prisoners in the Nagasaki area were forced to work in factories and shipyards despite their weakened condition. The work was hard, the hours were long, and the treatment was brutal. Many prisoners didn't survive the combination of malnutrition, overwork, and abuse. By the summer of 1945, the war in Europe had ended with Germany's surrender in May. The full weight of Allied military power could now focus on defeating Japan. American forces had captured Iwo Jima and Okinawa after bloody battles that demonstrated the Japanese military's determination to fight to the bitter end. American planners were preparing for an invasion of the Japanese home islands, an operation that would likely cost hundreds of thousands of American and Japanese lives. But there was another option being developed in secret: the atomic bomb. The Manhattan Project had successfully created the world's first atomic weapons. After testing a device in New Mexico in July 1945, American leadership faced a momentous decision: use these unprecedented weapons against Japan, or proceed with a conventional invasion. President Harry Truman, who had only become president after Franklin Roosevelt's death in April, authorized the use of atomic bombs against Japanese cities. The goal was to force Japan's surrender without an invasion. The first target was Hiroshima. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb nicknamed Little Boy on Hiroshima. The weapon detonated at approximately 8:15 in the morning, unleashing energy equivalent to about 15,000 tons of TNT. The explosion instantly incinerated everything near ground zero. A fireball hotter than the surface of the sun vaporized people, buildings, and structures. A massive shockwave radiated outward, flattening buildings and killing people kilometers from the explosion center. Thermal radiation ignited fires across the city. A mushroom cloud rose nearly 10 kilometers into the sky. The city of Hiroshima was essentially obliterated. Somewhere between 70,000 and 140,000 people died, either immediately or in the following weeks from radiation exposure and injuries. The world had never seen destruction on such a scale from a single weapon. Japanese leadership was stunned, but initially didn't fully grasp what had happened. Communication with Hiroshima had been completely cut off. Early reports were confused and contradictory. Some military leaders wanted to continue fighting despite this devastating blow. They believed American resolve would eventually weaken and that Japan could negotiate better surrender terms by continuing resistance. The debate raged within the Japanese government while American leadership waited to see if one atomic bombing would be sufficient to force surrender. 3 days after Hiroshima, on August 9, 1945, another B-29 bomber took off carrying a second atomic bomb, this one nicknamed Fat Man. The primary target was the city of Kokura on the northern coast of Kyushu. The bomber reached Kokura and made 3 runs over the city, but heavy clouds and smoke obscured visibility. The bombardier couldn't see the target clearly enough to drop the weapon. After waiting as long as fuel supplies permitted, the bomber turned toward its secondary target, Nagasaki. Joe Lee Kiyomiya was in the prisoner camp on the morning of August 9th. He had no idea what had happened at Hiroshima 3 days earlier. He had no idea that at that moment, a B-29 was approaching Nagasaki carrying a weapon that would kill tens of thousands of people in an instant. He was probably working or perhaps confined in one of the camp buildings. It was a hot summer day. Whatever Joe was doing, his life was about to intersect with one of history's most significant and terrible moments. At approximately 11 o'clock in the morning, the B-29 released its atomic bomb over Nagasaki. The weapon fell for about 43 seconds before detonating at an altitude of about 500 meters above the city. The explosion released energy equivalent to 21,000 tons of TNT, more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. An unprecedented flash of light brighter than 1,000 suns erupted over Nagasaki. People who were looking toward the explosion were instantly blinded. The fireball reached temperatures of millions of degrees, vaporizing everything at ground zero. The thermal radiation ignited fires across a massive area. People's clothing caught fire. Exposed skin burned instantly. The shockwave followed milliseconds later, traveling faster than the speed of sound. Buildings collapsed. Glass windows shattered into deadly projectiles. The blast wave killed people through blunt force trauma or by hurling them through the air into objects. A mushroom cloud rose into the sky, eventually reaching heights of over 18 kilometers. The city was devastated. Joe should have died. The prison camp was close enough to the explosion that virtually no one in the immediate area survived. The thermal radiation, the shockwave, and the resulting fires killed nearly everyone within the blast radius. But Joe happened to be inside a building with thick concrete walls when the bomb detonated. Those walls, probably built to withstand conventional bombing or to serve some industrial purpose, absorbed the shockwave that killed so many others. The concrete blocked most of the thermal radiation that burned people to death. The structure protected Joe from flying debris and the crushing force of the blast wave. When the explosion occurred, Joe probably felt the building shake violently. He heard a tremendous roar. Perhaps the walls cracked or parts of the structure collapsed, but the building held together enough to protect him from the immediate effects of the blast. While tens of thousands of people died instantly all around him, while the city was transformed into an inferno, Joe survived in a small pocket of protection created by concrete walls and pure chance. When he emerged from the building, Joe saw a landscape transformed into something resembling hell itself. Buildings were flattened or burning. Structures that had stood for decades or centuries were reduced to rubble. Bodies lay everywhere, many burned beyond recognition. Survivors wandered in shock, many with horrific injuries. People's skin hung in strips from their bodies where thermal radiation had burned them. Some people were blinded. Others had been hit by flying debris and were bleeding from multiple wounds. The fires created intense heat and smoke that choked survivors. The destruction was incomprehensible. Joe had survived combat, the Bataan Death March, years of imprisonment and torture. But he had never seen anything like this. Nothing in human experience compared to the aftermath of an atomic bombing. The sheer scale of death and destruction, the types of injuries, the complete obliteration of an entire city in a single instant, was beyond anything war had produced before. Joe wandered through this nightmare landscape, one of the few people in the immediate area who had survived without serious injury. The bombing of Nagasaki killed approximately 74,000 people, though exact numbers remain difficult to determine. Thousands more died in the following weeks and months from radiation exposure, burns, and injuries. The city had been home to about 250,000 people. In an instant, a significant portion of the population was killed and much of the city destroyed. The Urakami Valley, where the bomb actually detonated, was completely devastated. The bomb had missed its intended target due to clouds, detonating about 3 kilometers from the original aim point. But the destruction was still catastrophic. The twin atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, combined with the Soviet Union's declaration of war against Japan on August 8th, finally convinced Japanese leadership that continued resistance was impossible. Emperor Hirohito, who had remained largely in the background throughout the war, personally intervened to break a deadlock in the government. On August 15, 1945, 6 days after Nagasaki, the emperor made an unprecedented radio broadcast to the Japanese people announcing Japan's acceptance of the Allied terms for surrender. For most Japanese civilians, this was the first time they had ever heard the emperor's voice. The war was over. For prisoners of war throughout the Japanese Empire, liberation came swiftly. American forces moved immediately to locate and free prison camps. Medical teams rushed to provide care to survivors who were in desperate condition. Many former prisoners were critically ill, weighing barely more than skeletons, suffering from untreated diseases, injuries, and the effects of years of malnutrition and abuse. Medical personnel were shocked by what they found. The systematic brutality, the starvation, the complete disregard for international law and basic human decency had created conditions rivaling the Nazi concentration camps in Europe. Joe Lee Kiyumiya was liberated along with other survivors. After more than 3 years of captivity, after surviving the Bataan Death March, torture, starvation, disease, brutal treatment, transportation on a hell ship, and an atomic bomb, he was finally free. The journey home must have been surreal. Freed prisoners were evacuated by ship and aircraft back to the United States. They received medical care, food, clean clothes, and the strange experience of being treated like human beings again after years of degradation and abuse. The Navajo Code had remained unbroken throughout the entire war. Despite capturing equipment, intercepting thousands of messages, having a Navajo prisoner in their custody, and devoting significant intelligence resources to the problem, the Japanese never made any progress in cracking the system. The Code Talkers had transmitted critical information during every major Marine Corps operation in the Pacific. At Iwo Jima, 6 Code Talker nets operated around the clock during the first 2 days of the battle. They sent and received over 800 messages without error. At Okinawa, Code talkers were instrumental in coordinating the massive amphibious operation. Military analysts after the war confirmed that the Navajo Code was never broken. Major Howard Connor, a signal officer at Iwo Jima, stated that without the code talkers, the Marines never would have taken the island. The code's security was absolute. Its speed was remarkable. Code talkers could encode, transmit, and decode a 3-line English message in 20 seconds. Machines of the era took 30 minutes to do the same job. The combination of security and speed made the Navajo Code one of the most successful military communication systems ever created. The code and the code talkers' service remained classified after the war. The military believed the system might be useful in future conflicts and wanted to keep it secret. The code talkers themselves were sworn to secrecy and couldn't discuss their wartime service. It wasn't until 1968 that the code was finally declassified. Only then could the story be told publicly. The American public learned about these remarkable men who had used their native language to help win the war in the Pacific. Joe Lee Kiyomiya returned to civilian life carrying memories that few people could understand or relate to. He had experienced extraordinary events and witnessed history from a unique and terrible perspective. He settled back into life in the Southwest, living in New Mexico and Arizona near the Navajo lands where he had been born. Like many veterans, especially former prisoners of war, Joe rarely spoke about what he had endured. The physical scars eventually healed, though he carried permanent damage from frostbite and beatings. The psychological impact lasted a lifetime. Post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't well understood or recognized in the 1940s and 1950s. Veterans who struggled with nightmares, anxiety, hypervigilance, and other symptoms were often told to just move on or forget about it. Many former prisoners of war never fully recovered psychologically from their experiences. They had witnessed and endured horrors that left deep psychological wounds. Joe carried those wounds privately, as did thousands of other veterans who returned from the war. Over the decades, as the code talker's story gradually became public knowledge, Joe's experience took on additional significance. While his fellow Navajo men had been successfully using the code to help win battles, Joe had been tortured because he couldn't break that same code. His story represented a different facet of the same phenomenon. It demonstrated just how sophisticated and secure the code talker system truly was. Even with a native Navajo speaker and actual code transmissions, the Japanese got absolutely nowhere. The encryption system was simply too complex for anyone to penetrate without specific training. Joe Lee Kiyomiya died in 1997 at the age of 77. He passed away in New Mexico, returning in death to the lands where his life had begun almost 8 decades earlier. His life had encompassed extraordinary experiences spanning some of the 20th century's most significant events. He had endured some of World War II's worst atrocities and survived what killed hundreds of thousands of others. He had been part of one of history's most interesting footnotes, a man who spoke the language of an unbreakable code but couldn't decode it, confusing his captors and inadvertently protecting American secrets simply by telling the truth about his own ignorance. His legacy lives on in the historical record as a testament to survival, to resilience, to the strength of the human spirit under conditions designed to break it. His story reminds us that behind every major historical event are individual human experiences, often involving suffering and sacrifice that most people can never fully comprehend. Joe endured years of torture for information he genuinely didn't possess. He survived multiple events that killed thousands or tens of thousands of others. And he lived for more than 5 decades after liberation, carrying memories that shaped him in ways visible and invisible. The confusion that saved the Navajo Code also prolonged Joe's suffering. If he had somehow been able to break the code, the course of the Pacific War might have changed dramatically. American operational plans could have been compromised. Japanese forces might have anticipated invasions and prepared more effective defenses. American casualties could have been significantly higher. But Joe's inability to decode the messages, his genuine confusion when confronted with code talker transmissions, kept the secret secure. His truthful admission that the messages made no sense mirrored the Japanese confusion. Neither understood the sophisticated system the code talkers had created. That mutual incomprehension helped secure victory in the Pacific while condemning Joe to years of brutal treatment. The story ends in a sense where it began, with a young Navajo man from the reservation who enlisted to serve his country. That service took him to the Philippines, into the hell of Japanese captivity. through some of World War II's worst atrocities, and finally home again. His language and cultural identity, which should have been simple personal characteristics, became the focus of desperate enemy intelligence efforts. His honest inability to help his captors, his truthful confusion when confronted with messages he couldn't understand, led to prolonged suffering. But he survived. He came home. He lived a long life. And his story, like those of the code talkers he never met, reminds us of the remarkable and often tragic ways individual lives intersect with great historical events. If you found this incredible true story of survival, confusion, and unbreakable codes fascinating, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more amazing historical accounts. Hit that like button and drop a comment below telling us what aspect of Joe's story surprised you most. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.